When the fish are biting and you need to know when, where, and how to catch them, well, you've come to the right place. North Carolina Saltwater Weekly, where we talk fishing. And now, from the beautiful beaches of southeastern North Carolina, please welcome your host and mine, Captain Cook.
All right, guys, this is Captain Cook. I am so glad you could join me. This week, we're going to be talking about what pound test means on fishing line labels when you buy your spool of line. So you go to the tackle shop. We're going to the tackle shop again. We're going to buy some line, all right? So we decided we need some 20-pound test. Do you really know what you're getting when you buy your 20-pound test monofilament line? Do you really know what you're getting? So we're going to talk about a few important facts about that, and I hope you enjoy it. So let's go ahead and start off. We're going to start off with breaking strength. Now, what breaking strength is the amount of pressure that must be applied to an unknotted line before the line breaks. Every spool of fishing line, it carries a number that tells you what the product's breaking strength is. All of them do. They wouldn't sell if they didn't. Just a fishing line with nothing on it. Who's going to buy it? We don't know what it is. Now, fishing lines sold in North America, they're labeled according to their breaking strength. And primarily that's using the customary U.S. designation of pounds and also kilograms. For example, a 12-pound test, it'll be followed by a smaller number or print number that says 5.4 kilograms. That equals 12 pounds. Some lines are also labeled by diameter in inches and millimeters. And this can be important. And, something I've learned, that North American anglers usually ignore this, except for fly fishermen, because they work with fine leaders and tippets. But in Europe, this is the primary way they look at it is diameter. So you can buy a 20-pound test line. You look at the diameter of it, and next door to it is another 20-pound test line. The diameter is different, it's larger. So you're always going to be better off with the smaller diameter line because of resistance, wind resistance when you're casting, resistance in the water, and things like that. Braided lines, they're also labeled with a monofilament equivalent diameter, is what they are, stated in pounds. So say you got a braided line that's labeled 20-pound test, and it may be labeled as having a 0.009 inch diameter. And the label will state that this is equivalent diameter to a 6-pound test in monofilament. Now the labels on some braids may not specify the diameter, but simply state, what the nylon mono equivalent is. Say a 10-pound test has a 2-pound diameter. Now the reason why labels mention the nylon equivalent, well, that's because nylon is been around for decades. It's the most widely used line in the world, and most of us anglers we're familiar with it. Now the newer microfilaments, they're less known, but they're gaining. They're coming along. And really, that information, the diameter, it helps you relate. It helps you relate that to monofilament, to a standard, nylon monofilament fishing line. Now let's talk about wet breaking strength. Now the real issue with breaking strength, it's not what the label says. It's what is actually on the spool. The label can say whatever it wants. If the label says 20 pounds, but it breaks at 15, it's not 20 pounds. So the actual strength is really determined by how much force it takes to break the line that is wet. You guys remember we talked about this last week, wet line versus dry line. Like I said last week, this is the standard in which the International Game Fish Association, IGFA, that's how they test every line submitted with record applications. All right. So you submit a world record fish in this line category, they're going to test your line. You know, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter how the line breaks when it's dry because, like I said, nobody fishes a dry line. Now, most anglers, they assume that the breaking strength is designated or refers to the line in a dry state, and it doesn't. It's the wet state. That's really what you got to go by, because your monofilament it weakens because it absorbs water. It weakens in that wet state. Now, your labeled breaking strength of fishing line should indicate what happens when it's wet, not dry. But it's seldom the case, you know, because with test lines, and it's not explained anywhere. It's not on the packaging when you buy it. All right, we tested this in a dry state, but the breaking strength is really this in a wet state. That they don't tell you that. Let's talk about there's a difference between test and class lines. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of class lines or ever fishing before, but there are two breaking strength categories. One is referred to as test, and the other as class. Now, the difference between test and class is class lines are guaranteed to break at or under the labeled metric strength in a wet condition. In conformance with metric-based world record specifications established by the IGFA, such lines are specifically labeled as class or IGFA class. The IGFA, they don't really keep records of our customary measures in pounds, and any line not labeled as a class line, labeled a test line. And probably 95% of all lines sold is categorized as test line. Now, some manufacturers use the word test on the label, but many don't. But, you know, despite the labeled strength of a test line, hey, there's no guarantee, you know, as to the amount of force that's going to be required to break the line in either wet or dry conditions. There's no guarantee. You can have two spools, same brand, sitting side by side, 20-pound test, and they'll break totally at different dry and wet. They'll break at totally different poundage. So the label strength it's not going to reflect the actual what's required to break it. Since there's no guarantees, the test lines can break at, under, or over the labeled U.S. customary or metric strength. You never know. I mean, you just never know. And an overwhelming number will break label strength. There's some a little above and some way on up there. You know, 20 pounds could break at 25. So certain lines, especially nylon monofilaments, you know, they do experience significant strength loss when they're wet. They do. We talked about this last week. Now, lesser quality nylon monofilaments, they could actually suffer a strength loss of 20 to 30% when they're wet. And that's, you know, I always say, you know, you can buy a monofilament line just cheap, but you really do get what you pay for. And, you know, this is not something that you're having to spool your reel every week. This is something you do once a year, once every 2 years, whatever. So it really pays to put a little extra money into it and get a good name brand line, one that's, you know, and it really pays to do that. Braided line, infused microfilament lines. So they don't absorb water. They don't change in strength dry to wet. Now, I just want to interject something in here, and we're not getting off subject, but let's look at, we have monofilament, we have fluorocarbon, and we have microfilament or braided. Monofilament floats. Fluorocarbon does not. Braided does not. Monofilament absorbs water. Fluorocarbon does not. Microfilament does not. So why does monofilament not sink? Because it floats. Why doesn't it sink when it's wet? when the other two sink, but they don't absorb water. So really got to look at the physics of it. Monofilament absorbs water, yes. Yet when it's completely saturated, it is still less dense than the water that you're fishing in, so it won't sink. The other two, fluorocarbon and your braided, are already more dense than the water you're fishing in. And it doesn't matter if you're fishing in salt water or fresh water. And people will argue that fresh water is more dense than salt water or vice versa. Well, actually, salt water is more dense than fresh water. It actually, a cubic foot of salt water weighs approximately 64 pounds, and a cubic foot of fresh water weighs 62.2 pounds. Now, got 1.8 pound difference, but if you break it down into a gallon, salt water weighs 8.6 pounds per gallon, and fresh water weighs 8.5. So there's not a big difference there. So you can't argue that, well, it's because of the density of the water. And density varies in salt water and fresh water. But that really asks, well, why doesn't it sink? Well, because it's still, even completely saturated, it's less dense than the water that you're fishing in. All right, so let's get back to what we were talking about. All right, so braided and fused microfilament lines. They do not absorb water, so that doesn't change the strength from dry to wet. And the same thing with fluorocarbon lines. They don't absorb water, they don't weaken in a wet state, but this doesn't mean these lines are stronger. It means that what you get when it's dry, that's what you get when it's wet. It also doesn't mean that these lines are immune from strength mislabeling. Now, a line labeled as 20-pound test may not actually break at 25 pounds. So there's a lot going on with fishing lines, guys. And this information, now this type of information is essential to people who fish deliberately for world records in specific line categories. You know, they study this, man. But the average angler like me and you, hell, we don't know about this, and most of us don't care about it. But if you're real particular about your fishing and you care about it and you want to learn everything you can about it, you know, it's often these little details like this, your line diameter, it helps you out. It can't hurt. So it helps for your success. So guys, that's what I've got for the what pound test means on a fishing line label. I do thank you guys very much for joining me. I hope you learned a little something here that you can take away from it and think about it next time you're looking at fishing line and diameters, and just think about it. And I hope you got something out of it. I do thank you so much for joining me. I've had a great time researching this and putting this out there for you guys. I hope you guys join me next week, and we'll talk about something else exciting got to do with anything fishing. You're going to find it here. All right, guys, I thank you so much for joining me. This is Captain Cook. You guys take care.
Well, that's going to about wrap up another week of North Carolina Saltwater Weekly. Be sure and tune back in with us where we can keep you informed on the best places to cast, catch, and fish right here in beautiful southeastern North Carolina.